would make time for a debate on the massacre that is taking place in Gaza. We note that they have now conceded that. Probably not a coincidence that a motion was being put down in the Dáil by the Soc Dems, and also that there is a major demonstration planned outside the Dáil tomorrow at 5:30, and we will be urging thousands of people to join that demonstration to pile the pressure on the government for their shameful failure to support South Africa's demand for provisional measures now to stop Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza. Vague references to what they may do in the future, or simply rhetorical calls for a ceasefire, are not good enough. South Africa has led the way in demanding that the international community impose sanctions and adopt measures that will stop Israel committing the genocide that is ongoing in Gaza. And we expect the Irish government to respect the views of the Irish public and to discharge their obligations under the Genocide Convention to support the South African case, and to publicly state that support and to further intervene at the case at the nearest opportunity. So we await the government amendment, but frankly I doubt at this stage, I hope I'm wrong, but I very much doubt the government are going to do much more than make rhetorical references to ceasefire, but continue to fail to actually concretely support what South Africa is doing in calling out Israel's genocide and demanding the international community adopt measures to stop that genocide now, notwithstanding any further investigation and prosecution for crimes already committed. The other thing I think we have to mention is there are very, very worrying reports of comments made by the Ceann Comhairle at a gathering of the European Jewish Association, which we believe need to be clarified. The reports suggest an implication by the Ceann Comhairle that there is a rise of anti-Semitism and imply or infer that as well as this being, which it clearly is, on an ongoing basis driven by far-right and fascist groups, which should be absolutely condemned, an inference that somehow the left are responsible for this, and an implication really that if you criticize Israel's genocidal assault in Gaza, if you indict Israel, as multiple human rights organizations have, for crimes against humanity for decades, as Human Rights Watch have, as Amnesty International have, as UN Special Rapporteurs on the Middle East have, that somehow you're guilty of anti-Semitism. Now that needs to be seriously clarified, because those of us who condemn Israeli apartheid, who condemn Israel's genocide in Gaza, who condemn the illegal occupation of Palestinian territory, do so precisely because we oppose racism. We oppose an apartheid system that segregates people on racist and religious lines, that discriminates against them on racist and religious lines. So opposition to the policies and the apartheid regime that Israel presides over is motivated by opposition to racism of all types, including opposition to anti-Semitism. So we believe the Ceann Comhairle, as a matter of urgency, needs to clarify that and withdraw any suggestion that those who criticize Israel for its genocidal policies or its apartheid policies are somehow anti-Semitic, when the opposite is the truth. We are motivated by opposition to all forms of racism. Lastly, I just want to mention quickly the issue of the Planning and Development Bill. The requirement for amendments amendments have to be submitted to the Planning and Development Bill, a huge piece of legislation and a very important piece of legislation have to be in by tomorrow. Now, we'll be putting in a lot of amendments, but one I particularly want to signal, given the absolutely dire housing crisis and the unaffordability of rents and house prices, which is contributing to an ever escalating and dire housing crisis and homelessness crisis, we will be submitting an amendment seeking that all development, residential development, should have at least 50% social and affordable housing. Currently, the legislation being proposed by the government will require that it be not more than 20% social and affordable, which, by the way, and people should note this, is a dilution of the social and affordable requirements in the old Planning and Development Act, where you had to have 20% social and affordable housing. The new bill the government are proposing is saying that it should be not more than that. Now, given that the vast majority of working people are completely priced out of the housing that is being delivered by the private sector at the moment, rents are unaffordable, house prices are unaffordable, we believe this planning bill has to be used to actually ensure the delivery on a mass scale of social and affordable housing, and that a minimum requirement for all developments of any scale should be a minimum of 50% social and affordable housing in order to address the housing crisis. So we'll be submitting those amendments tomorrow.
Just to start with the reports at the weekend in the Sunday Business Post about the possibility of the government seeking to introduce what would effectively be an internet tax, replacing the TV licence with a monthly extra charge on broadband of 10 or 15 euros extra a month. We want this week to warn the government that any attempt to impose an internet tax will see mass opposition along the lines of the opposition to the water charges. An internet tax, a 15 euro monthly charge on broadband, would be a regressive tax. Broadband is not some luxury, but an essential for basically everybody to have in their home. And the consequence of charging everyone 15 euros for it is that the poorest family in the country will be faced with paying an extra 15 euros a month, and the very richest family in the country would also pay the same 15 euros a month. So it's inherently unjust, regressive tax, just like the TV licence. We also, of course, call for the TV licence to be abolished. I think one reason that they're considering moving to this sort of internet tax is to get around the fact that around 50% of people are now voting with their feet or effectively boycotting the TV licence. So the idea of incorporating it into an existing bill is an attempt to get around that. And they should not do that, but similarly the TV licence itself, also a regressive tax, should be scrapped. And instead we've put forward the idea of a big tech tax on the social media giants owned by multi-billionaires who dominate our media landscape to properly fund public service broadcasting and public service news, entertainment and so on right across the country. Second point I just want to raise briefly is people have probably seen that across Europe, across the world, pro-Palestinian protest has been criminalised or threatened to be criminalised. That's particularly stark in Britain, where there have been talks of banning mass protests or making protesters pay for the policing of those protests. Obviously, that is absolutely scandalous. However, there are worrying signs now in Ireland that we're beginning to see the criminalisation of pro-Palestinian protest. A young man, Darrell, an activist, pro-Palestinian activist, was fined €1,000 yesterday in court simply for standing beside the Israeli embassy. He wasn't accused of anything other than standing beside the Israeli embassy during a protest. When the Gardaí asked people to leave, he wasn't accused of anything else. He simply was standing peacefully beside the Israeli embassy and yet has been fined €1,000. That's very worrying. It's very worrying in terms of the tens and tens of thousands, if not 100,000 of people who have participated in some form of pro-Palestinian protest over the course of the last more than 3 months. It's also very worrying when it stands in such stark contrast to the inaction of the state in relation to the far right and the really softly approach that has been adopted by the state in relation to the far right. Final thing, just to add to the comments that Richard made about the Ceann Comhairle's remarks, I mean, it is just completely inappropriate for the Ceann Comhairle, a supposedly neutral arbiter of debate in our parliament, to make such a nakedly political intervention, blaming and slandering the left as being responsible for anti-Semitism. He needs to clarify, as Richard said, he needs to clarify who he's talking about. He named the left. I mean, it's actually a lot of political parties in the Dáil, almost half of the Dáil, would consider themselves to be left to some degree or other. Who exactly is he talking about? What comments is he referring to? And is he, as Richard suggests, and I think is likely, in fact, equating criticism of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism? And the two things are very much not the same, and it's very, very important that those things are separated in order to avoid an actual rise of anti-Semitism. So we will be raising this in the Dáil during the day and calling for a very clear statement of how this happened and what authority he made this intervention as Ceann Comhairle. I don't think it was ever brought up at the Business Committee that he was going to speak at such a meeting. So how exactly this happened, I think there's very serious questions to be answered.
Can I just ask you about that? Whoever wants to take it on the issue of the Ceann Comhairle? We don't know because he hasn't said, so maybe the clarification will bring that out. Could it be what Richard said a few weeks ago in relation to that word filthy being used? Could that be an example of where you're crossing over the line between legitimate debate and critique into something else?
No, I absolutely don't. I mean, what is horrific, filthy, disgusting is what is being done to the people of Gaza. And I don't think that's a controversial statement. And it most certainly isn't a statement that implies anti-Semitism. It is motivated by horror at the genocidal assault. I mean, under international law, genocide is the worst crime that you can commit. And we have a very, very credible case being put forward by South Africa of a genocide being committed by Israel. But long before the current escalation of violence, we had pretty much every human rights organization of note in the world saying that Israel has been guilty for decades of crimes against humanity. Now, if it isn't justified to call that out and use strong language to condemn crimes against humanity that are being alleged, and I think many people believe are being perpetrated by Israel for decades, and we're seeing it now unfold in front of our eyes, there's no reason at all to suggest or infer that denotes anti-Semitism. It's horror at the destruction of humanity by a state that is based on principles of ethnic cleansing and apartheid. So, I don't think there's any justification, and it's a worrying echoing of Israel's own narrative. Because Israel, rather than address the allegations of genocide and apartheid, simply call all their critics anti-Semites in order to close off the conversation. That's just not acceptable.
We do expect, Richard, that is what those comments were branded at the time. They were branded anti-Semitic.
They were branded by the Israeli ambassador. What else would she say?
The Taoiseach disagreed with them as well.
Yeah, but the Taoiseach has poured cold water on South Africa's case. Let's be absolutely clear. The Irish government poured cold water from the outset on South Africa's case against genocide against Israel. And I, to be honest, I do not understand how there is not a serious questioning of the narrative that all of the horror that we are now witnessing began on October the 7th, when we have multiple reports, it was raised on multiple occasions in this parliament, that human rights organisations were indicting Israel for war crimes and crimes against humanity long before any of this started. And our government did nothing, the international community did nothing, Israel has been allowed to act with impunity, and is it any wonder that then it leads on to the sort of horror we are now witnessing? So we make no apologies for condemning genocide and apartheid in the strongest terms, but to somehow imply that's anti-Semitism is outrageous. Outrageous.
Just add to the point, look, this tactic of smearing those on the left, critics of the actions of the Israeli state, as anti-Semitic. This is a tried and tested tactic by the political establishment. And it's a tactic which worked against Jeremy Corbyn. That was the key tactic that was used to bring Jeremy Corbyn down. They happened upon it and they kept going and going and going. And so we're going to take a stand and refuse. You can look through our records and you will not find a single iota of anti-Semitism. Socialists are the biggest fighters against racism of all sorts. There is a very proud history of Jewish socialists, anti-Zionists, Jewish socialists who are, like, we look to and we learn from their writings and so on. So you will not find a single part of anti-Semitism in what we say. You will find consistent criticism of Israel, and we think it's very important that the whole Palestinian solidarity movement stands up and says, we refuse this equation of criticism of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism. That was the point of the IRHA definition of anti-Semitism, was to equate these two things, and that is absolutely wrong and is dangerous because it actually can open the door to anti-Semitism. There are anti-Semites out there on social media criticizing what Israel is doing at the moment and using the war to try and drive a right-wing agenda of anti-Semitism. We are absolutely opposed to that. We call that out consistently, but we will not be silenced by the likes of Alan Shatter making completely baseless allegations suggesting we're anti-Semitic. In his article in the Sunday Independent, he claims that we eulogize Hamas without a single quote from us, without a single amount of proof to indicate how we eulogize Hamas. Of course, we do not eulogize Hamas, but this is a tried and tested tactic to silence Palestinian solidarity supporters and silence those on the left, and we are not going to be accepting it from Alan Shatter or from the Ceann Comhairle or from anyone else.
Will you be calling on the Ceann Comhairle and your order of business today, or any other avenue to clarify those remarks?
Yes, we need to work out exactly what the appropriate moment is, but we will be calling for him to clarify the remarks, yeah.
You mentioned that that Irish government put forward proposed law for that that's the case to start, and Taoiseach said today that they will contest the case. Just now isn't the right time, essentially. So are you seeing that as a U-turn then?
No, it shows that they're under pressure, and it's why we're having the demonstration tomorrow, and we would appeal to people who are absolutely horrified at an ongoing massacre and genocide in Gaza to get out on the streets and demand our government do something. But to be honest, talking about joining the case later, possibly, when there's a genocide happening now, is worse than useless. I mean, the whole point of the South African action was to demand provisional measures under the Genocide Convention to stop the genocide that's happening now. We needed the international community to take measures to stop Israel's slaughter before the already horrific situation in Gaza gets even worse. I mean, famine is now threatened. 2 million people, virtually the whole population displaced. 25,000 people dead, thousands more buried under the rubble. I mean, what more does the international community or our government need before they will actually do something to try and sanction Israel, to try and prevent the continuation of this massacre? So it is supporting the provisional measures being requested is what's needed, not some sort of long-fingered investigation that may not actually take place for years. That is of no use. And I want to stress, and it's something we put forward a motion calling on the government in November to initiate action under the Genocide Convention. And we said at the time, and I just want to repeat, the Genocide Convention confers legal obligations on all of its signatories to act to prevent genocide, not simply to hold people accountable after the fact, but to prevent a genocide. And we believe that there is an absolutely overwhelming case for the international community to act to do that, including our government.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.